Since the discovery of a large metal object in Utah's Red Rock Desert, several others have appeared from Romania to the south coast of England. What are these metal monoliths that seem to be popping up all over the world? Is it art? Is it a hoax? And why are we drawn in by such oddities? Dr. Joan Saab is a professor of art history and visual and cultural studies at the University of Rochester, New York. She is the author of Objects of Vision, Making Sense of What We See. Thanks so much for taking some time for us today, Dr. Saab.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here. It's sort of the sweet spot of what I do, hoaxes and public art coming together at this particular moment in time. So I'm happy to.
Yeah, well, these appearances of monoliths bear a striking resemblance to the structures in Space Odyssey, and it appears the one in Utah has been around for a while. Not the first time we've been fascinated by something that feels somewhat otherworldly. What other phenomena can we liken them to?
Well, these sorts of, I would say, I don't want to say conspiracy theories, but these sorts of narratives around objects that seem to have no origin story, that seem to come out of nowhere, these have been around for some time. I mean, people talk about the crop circles that you can see from outer space and the burial mounds that we have in the Midwest of the United States, as well as, I mean, there are all sorts of narratives and stories about the Great Pyramids in Egypt and in Mexico, and how could they possibly have been built by, manual labor. So there are all sorts of people who think that this is evidence of alien life or some supernatural phenomena. And they, these, within the American context, within the United States at least, this goes back all the way almost to the country's founding. And anytime I think there are moments of crisis, these types of things tend to sort of grab the public imagination. So not surprisingly, there were all sorts of encounters with the spirit world around the American Civil War and again around World War I, when young people were dying in very tragic ways. This is when we had the birth of sort of spirit photography. And I don't think it's surprising that in a moment where so many people are stuck at home, these monoliths have really captured the public imagination and spurned all sorts of ideas about where they came from and who put them there and why they put them there. And my guess is they're not all put by the same people or beings or phenomena, but it depends on what you want to believe. And I think that's a little bit about what I just wrote about in my most recent book, is how people are always looking for evidence of what it is they want to believe. And I think these monuments or monoliths or whatever they are, provide an opportunity for people to surmise the existence of aliens or otherworldly things, or a hoax. I mean, there are a lot of people who think they're a hoax, or there are other people who think that, there was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about a minimalist artist who his son and his dealer think that perhaps he put it there, but the first one went in, according to the sleuths on Google Earth, and that's another story we can talk about, probably around 2016, and John McCracken, who is the artist that people think that these pieces resemble his work, he was already dead. And so there's all kinds of zany stories about where these things came from. And I think for different groups of people, they allow them to believe in the possibility of all sorts of things.
Well, some have been claimed. I think the one in South England has been claimed. Others have definitely not. What was your immediate reaction? And did that reaction change when you started to see all these copycats popping up?
Well, my immediate reaction with the first one in Utah was that it was probably some sort of, if not it was some sort of artistic intervention, that somebody put it there for some reason. And I'm being very vague here because it could be an environmental intervention. It could have been about, a sort of land art, there's lots of ways that within an art historical context, you could read that particular monolith. And then it's it spurned a really interesting, as I sort of mentioned a minute ago, about these people who have gone to Google Earth and gone back to images of that particular spot to see when something that resembled the monolith appeared, and they've now said it's around 2016. And so there's all sorts of technologies of vision that are allowing people to travel remotely without leaving home, although people then started going to Utah and then it disappeared. And then, one showed up in Romania and one showed up in California. And I just printed something out of the USA Today this morning because I put an alert on my Twitter so that anytime anybody references a monolith, it gives, I'm getting all sorts of crazy stuff on my Twitter, which is crazy enough to begin with. But there was another one today in sort of remote parts of Australia. Like, they're now popping up in different locations. And I think that the pop-up ones, the more recent iterations, are not part of the same original movement. And so the first one I thought was probably a deliberate placement for some sociocultural statement. These new ones, some of them I'm sure we're going to find out they've been put there by like Elon Musk or somebody as a sort of, I'm just grabbing somebody as a commercial venue. There's one that's in a shopping mall in England, and, there was one in Vegas, then there's one in Romania and one in the Ukraine. I don't know that they're all serving the same purpose, but they're now part of a network of monoliths that are talking to one another, even if their origins and ultimate goals are different. So my thinking on it, to go back to your original question, my thinking has certainly evolved. And I think it's worth paying attention to, even though they're kind of silly. I think that this is a moment, I think the silly is something that we should always pay attention to, because I think beneath it, or the interest in it, is emblematic of something else. And I think, I don't know if you saw, there was one in California, and a group of men wearing like night vision goggles and, camo uniform, like they taped it. You can Google this and it'll show up. They went in the middle of the night and tore it down and put up a giant cross while chanting, "Christ is King, Christ is King," and then said all sorts of sort of really xenophobic stuff about aliens, and talking about extraterrestrial aliens as well as aliens from across the border of the southern United States to Mexico. And so that sort of guerrilla performance is very different from the lone monument in a canyon in Utah.
Well, you suggest in your book that what we see and how we see it are often historically situated and culturally constructed. What did you think of our collective reaction? What does our collective reaction say about this specific period that we're living in right now?
Well, as I said earlier, a lot of times these, what I am calling objects of vision, so material manifestations of the immaterial, right? Spirit photography, miraculous, visions, of the Virgin Mary that appear on jacket garments, or, even like pieces of toast, right? They are usually around moments, not always, but often around moments of crisis. And I think we're clearly in a global moment of uncertainty and crisis. And so even though these monoliths have been, according to the Google Earth sleuths, around in these remote places for some time, the proliferation of them across the globe, I think, speaks to this networked global moment where we're all kind of stuck in our houses and we're looking for meaning or higher purpose. And so the idea that there may be life on, extraterrestrial life that has put them down here, right? That's one of the big conspiracy theories. I'm calling it a conspiracy, but maybe it's not. This idea that aliens place them. Well, the moments that people start believing in aliens are the moments when, they can't explain something. So those are, aliens, spirits, ghosts, miracles. They're all, to me, part of a sort of network of making sense of things that we cannot make sense of. And I think there are ways that we ground them, in this case, very concretely, in metal beams that are stuck into the ground. So it's fascinating to me, and I'm really interested to see how they play out and how different groups of people make sense of them.
So it turns out that seeing is believing is not really as reliable as we think.
Well, yes and no. So it's not as reliable as we think, and I think we all know that. I mean, there's an example I use in my most recent book about this fake giant, the Cardiff giant from the 1860s that local businessman in Utica, New York, so not too far from me, had commissioned to basically, he got into an argument with some people who believe that the events of the Bible were literally real, like historical time, that they're trying to equate them with historical time. So he commissioned this giant sort of fossilized man, and he buried it on his brother-in-law's farm. And then like 2 years later, I mean, this was a long sort of con, he buried it. And 2 years later, he commissioned somebody to dig a well in exactly the place where it was buried. So these workers came in and they buried it, and they're like, oh my God, we found a fossilized man that's ginormous, and it must be a biblical giant. And people came from all over to see it. He then confessed that it was fake, and even more people came to see it. And P.T. Barnum tried to buy it, and he sold it because he was selling tickets to come and see it, and he sold it to a group of businessmen who then who raised the price, and more people came to see it. And P.T. Barnum, they wouldn't sell it to Barnum, so Barnum just made his own giant, like out of wood and straw, and put it on display in his museum, and people came to see it, knowing that it was fake. And so I think there is this relationship between seeing and wanting to believe in the possibility of things that are beyond our imagination, beyond our control, and the wondrous and the supernatural. And so even though people often know these things are not the literal one-to-one evidence of whatever miracles or spirits or extraterrestrials, I think they do suggest the possibility that they could exist even by knowing they're fake, if that makes sense. And so I do think there is a relationship between seeing and believing, but it's not indexical. It's not a one-to-one evidentiary relationship. So, and this is, as I said, it's persisted for centuries.
Well, our inclination to believe supernatural origins in things like crop circles and ghost photos and such is one thing. What about the other side? Why do we like to trick others?
I think sometimes there's, with the case of Stubbs Newell, who I was just talking about, the tobaccoist who created the Cardiff Giant, I think it was to make a point. I think sometimes there's a couple of examples of these young women, the Fox sisters, who were the first sort of to communicate with the deads in the 19th century spiritualist movement. There's a group of young girls, like pre-teenage girls, who took some photographs of some fairies that then people thought, this was in England, the Cottonley fairies, that of all people, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle saw these and embarked on a sort of real like Sherlock Holmes investigation into the fairies. And I think they started out as games, and then they took on a life of their own. So I don't know that the impulse to trick is always the same. In the case of Newell, it was to make a point. This was just right after Darwin, when people were trying to reconcile biblical time with geological time. And he was saying, no, this is not real. And I think he was trying to dupe people. Barnum, I think he was all in favor of what he called the humbug. And for him, that was, a type of experience that transformed people out of their everyday lives. And so I think that people trick people for a variety of reasons, and people allow themselves to be tricked for a number of reasons. Sometimes it supports their political or religious or social or cultural beliefs and sort of substantiates it. Sometimes it just provides an escape from the day realities of everyday life. And so I don't know that there's one answer for all of them.
It's really interesting because if memory serves me, I think those businessmen who bought that giant paid a hefty price, somewhere around $40,000, even knowing it was fake. How do you see this playing?
Barnum I don't know if you know this part of the story, which I love, and it reminds me of like the present moment when we talk about fake news. So they sued Barnum because Barnum said he had the real giant, and the case went to court. And because they did, it was $40,000. And back in 1869, that was a tremendous, that's a lot of money today, but that was a tremendous amount of money back then. And they sued Barnum, and the judge was like, no, you can't sue one another because the giant's not real. Like, you can't say that this is the real giant and that's the real giant and that's the fake giant. They're both fakes. And it was an interesting moment in terms of, but they all knew it was fake. And they didn't care, and they were still trying to bring the legal system into it in a way that this judge had had enough. He was like, this is nuts, and threw it out. So I don't know. I don't think that was the question you were asking, though. So,
Well, as you say, I think we can see how this plays into other trends like the rise of misinformation or alternative facts that we're seeing today.
yeah, I think so too. And I think right now we're in such a media saturated world, and this is how we receive some, especially at a moment where so many of us can't go out to other places. So this is how we're receiving not just our information and our news, but our education and our, kids are going to school over Zoom, and professional conferences and family reunions and holidays and news reports. And it's hard to differentiate for a lot of people between what is real and what is constructed. And I mean, some people would say it's all constructed, but I think it becomes harder and harder to get to that idea of what is legitimate evidence and what is fact and what is speculation. And so, yeah, I think this is why I think that these monoliths have really taken off, because I would imagine, I don't want to get into, proofs, but I would imagine that most people don't think they were placed by aliens, but they do, as you pointed out in the beginning of this conversation, look very similar to the monoliths from 2001. And so they're familiar to anybody who's a consumer of popular culture. And so they're playful in that way. But, the people who tore one down and put up a cross in the middle of the night were threatened or something by it, that they felt the need to do it. Whereas others think it's kind of fun. And I think others are putting them up all over the globe to, here's another one. And so it becomes an almost scavenger hunt, or where's the next one going to come from? So I think they're filling a number of sociocultural needs right now for people who are stuck at home and getting all their information and a lot of their connection with other people through screens.
Well, I think we can put some stock at least into the old saying, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. Dr. Saab, thanks for sharing with Newspoint 360 today on such a remarkably fascinating topic.
Well, it was my pleasure. And yeah, we'll see where the next one is.